Here's a deliberately boring, sleep-inducing version of medieval misery, suitable for drifting off to sleep while learning why it sucked to survive the plague. Why it sucked to survive the plague. A very boring historical lullaby. Once upon a time, in the slow grey century of the 1300s, many people lived in small, muddy villages where the most exciting part of the day was turning turnips into soup. Then came the Black Death, which was a bubonic plague caused by a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. It was carried by fleas on rats, and those rats liked to hang out in grain sacks and wooden carts, and sometimes people's beds. Very unhygienic, but that's how it was. Anyway, about 25 to 50 million people died. That's a lot. That's somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. But this is not about them. It's about the people who survived. Unfortunately. If you were one of the unlucky survivors, congratulations. Your prize was rotting infrastructure. Most of the skilled workers, carpenters, masons, cooks, and anyone remotely good at doing anything, were dead. So the roofs leaked, the bread was burned, and the ale was awful. Smell. Streets were full of decomposing bodies, rotting food, and human waste. Sanitation was a forgotten dream, like a nice bath or shoes without holes. Social collapse. Everyone you knew was gone. Entire villages were empty. You could just walk into someone's abandoned house and sit in their chair, which would have been cool, except you were sad, traumatized, and possibly also mildly insane from watching half the town cough itself to death. Blame games. People accused each other of witchcraft, or blamed the Jews, or said it was a punishment from God. So if you survived, you could now look forward to burning at the stake or being chased out of town by a mob with pitchforks and a deep lack of understanding of germ theory. Medical help. Doctors, if you could call them that, wore bird masks and waved incense around. Their treatments included bloodletting, applying dead animals to boils, or just saying huh and walking away slowly. Economy. Prices went wild. Wages rose because workers were scarce, but inflation meant your handful of silver bought you exactly one sad onion and half a sheep. No change, sorry. Recurring plagues. The plague didn't just go away. It kept coming back every few years. So just when you thought you were safe, surprise, another round of lymph node roulette. Mental health. Nobody called it PTSD, but if you survived, you probably had it, along with a deep fear of sneezing. God bless you became more of a desperate prayer than a pleasantry. And so, life went on. Dull, dirty, miserable, and punctuated by death. You'd spend your days farming bad soil, burying neighbors, avoiding coughing crowds, and trying not to get burned as a heretic. But hey, at least you weren't bored. Until now. Sleep tight. The tale of bleak, boring survival in plague-ridden medieval Europe. Perfect bedtime despair. Things got worse. Somehow. Now that you, the unfortunate plague survivor, had made it past the first few waves of pestilence and existential horror, you could settle into the slow, grinding rhythm of medieval life, which mostly involved waiting for things to either kill you or get moldy. Food. Farming was hard, mostly done by hand, with wooden tools and zero helpful apps. You ate a lot of porridge, gray, bland, mushy porridge. Sometimes you added onions. If it was a feast day, you might get salt herring. Protein-packed, but suspiciously smelly. Sometimes there was a famine because nobody remembered how to grow things well anymore, or because the weather just decided to be apocalyptically bad for 4 years in a row. That happened. It was called the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, and it felt like a sequel nobody wanted. Weather. You lived during a period called the Little Ice Age, which sounds cute but wasn't. Crops failed, rivers froze, and there was no central heating, just fire, if you had dry wood and remembered how to light it. Winters were long. You got chilblains. Sometimes your toes turned black. Nobody cared. Housing. A survivor's home was often a wattle and daub hut made of sticks, mud, and straw. Roofs leaked. Drafts were constant. There were no windows, just holes. And the floor, dirt. Just dirt. Some animals lived inside with you. Chickens, maybe a pig. It smelled like damp fur, wet clay, and regret. Personal hygiene. Baths were rare. Not because people didn't want them, but because warm water took forever to heat, and disease was still blamed on bathing. So you just scrape the grime off now and then, or roll in herbs and hope for the best. You wore the same woolen tunic for weeks. Underwear, if any, was not changed often. Lice were common. People had favorite louse-picking spoons. Favorite. Fun. What? Did you do for fun? You stared at the fire, or watched rats. Maybe listened to a traveling friar talk about sin. Sometimes a juggler came to town. That was a big day. If you were lucky, a festival came around, where you could throw cabbages at a man in a bear costume and drink cider until you forgot you had plague scars. Medicine, revisited, you still had no access to anything helpful. Physicians diagnosed your humors. If they were imbalanced, you were bled again. Sometimes they made you drink mercury. Sometimes they just shrugged and gave you prayers and onions. Clothing. You wore layers of coarse wool, scratchy linen, and shoes, made from whatever leather could be found. Buckles were luxury items. Buttons, sorcery. You tied everything with strings and hoped it didn't unravel in the mud. The church. The church tried to offer comfort, but mostly warned you that this whole plague thing was probably your fault. They rang bells, held mass burials, and sold indulgences. If you had money, you could buy your dead uncle out of purgatory. Otherwise, you just prayed harder. Death came slowly. If the plague didn't get you, infection from a blister might. Or a cut on your foot, or childbirth, or contaminated water. Sometimes you just stopped breathing in your sleep, and nobody asked why. They just said, God willed it, and moved on. The dull march of time years passed. The sky was often grey. So was the food and the soup and your mood. You worked, you slept, you prayed, you tried not to get fleas. If you were lucky, you made it to 40, which was considered a decent lifespan. You had 4 teeth, 2 goats, and a vague sense that life had once been better, but you couldn't remember when. You sometimes wondered if dying during the first wave would have been the better deal. But then again, the wind on your face, the distant bells, the clanging of the village smith, it was something, maybe even something like hope. But mostly, it sucked. Now close your eyes, drift off, and be grateful you're not sleeping on straw stuffed with bugs next to a coughing uncle named Osric into the historically accurate sadness that was surviving the medieval plague. You are now too alive, too cold, and too bored to die. Ailments, accidents, and other awful things that just happened all the time. Dental care, toothache? There was one solution, yanking it out, usually done with pliers by someone with no training, possibly drunk, possibly a blacksmith. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and certainly no follow-up care. You might die of infection. Or just carry on, chewing mush with your gums and pretending you were fine. Teeth fell out often, gums bled often, breath was unpleasant. Breaking a bone. Break your leg, that's a wrap. No, literally, someone might wrap it in a board and linen, tell you to stay still, and then never check on it again. If it healed wrong, you limped forever. If it got infected, they cut off your leg, probably with a rusty saw and a priest holding your hand. You screamed. Everyone screamed. The chickens screamed. Jobs. Post-plague. There were more jobs. That was the one silver lining. Unfortunately, they were still awful. Gravedigger. Constant death. No bath. Tanner. Scraping rotting hides with urine? Gong farmer? You literally shoveled human waste out of latrines for a living. The job market was wide open, but the options were all distressing. Marriage. You married young, like 14, sometimes younger. Marriage was not about love. It was about surviving winter with help. If your spouse died, likely, you remarried fast. Love might grow later, if you were lucky, and neither of you smelled too bad. Romantic gestures included not giving your partner lice and letting them eat the bigger potato. Childbirth. Childbirth. The leading cause of death for women. No pain relief, no sterile tools. Just a room full of worried midwives, some boiling water, and an herbal poultice that did exactly nothing. If the baby lived, everyone celebrated quietly. If you both lived, it was a miracle. Infant mortality was high, so you didn't name the baby right away. You waited to see if it made it through the first winter. Harsh, but practical. Literacy. You couldn't read, not even signs. The Bible was in Latin. You memorized prayers and hoped the priest wasn't making it all up. Books were handwritten by monks and cost more than your entire house. So you told stories by firelight, repeated things wrong, and passed knowledge down by rumor and goat-based metaphors. The law. Justice was flexible. Trials by ordeal were common. Walk across hot coals to prove your innocence. Or get dunked in a river. If you floated, you were a witch. If you sank, you were innocent, but also drowned. Either way, not great odds. Theft, could lose a hand. Gossip, could get your tongue pierced with a nail. Vagrancy, jail, or stocks. Or just a beating. Holidays. At last, something positive. There were a lot of holy days, which meant time off. You might get a feast, or ale, or a play put on by a traveling troupe with dubious accents and paper masks. But most festivals ended with someone in a fight, a fire breaking out, and 3 goats running loose. The hope that refused to die. Despite all of this, somehow, people lived. They sang badly. They danced clumsily. They carved faces into tree trunks and told jokes about the Lord Mayor's gout. Kids played with hoops. People fell in love, even while covered in dirt and despair. Someone always had a fiddle. Someone always brewed something vaguely alcoholic. Because what else was there? So if you're lying in your soft bed now, with clean sheets and working plumbing, and you think, ugh, my phone's not charging right, just remember, you could be a 14th century plague survivor trying to sleep on straw while a goat eats your bee. Blanket, good night, sleep soundly. The lice can't get you here.